Welcome to the Growth Through Adversity podcast, where men are forged, not coddled. Here we dive deep into the path of true transformation in pursuit of physical, mental, spiritual, and temporal growth. We talk training, nutrition, business, mindset, and spirituality. We embrace strength and we loathe ease. We reject weakness in every form and cultivate power, the will to power itself. This is the rebirth of modern man. Raw masculinity, tempered by reason, virtue, and right action, because nothing of value is earned without sacrifice. Let's begin our apotheosis together. Welcome to another episode of the Growth Through Adversity podcast. True strength is not just the might of body. True strength is the will to hunger, to bleed, to thirst, to suffer without betraying what is sacred within you. Today we descend into the oldest mysteries of the masculine soul, Odin's self-sacrifice, the death that is not death, the ancient rite of becoming more than a man through suffering and initiation. Today I want to break down a very important story to me of Odin's self-sacrifice to himself on Yggdrasil, or the world tree. So I'm going to read directly from the Hávamál, and I'm going to go through the Norse first, and I'm probably going to butcher it, and then I'm going to break it down in English, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means, because I think this idea of initiation and of the death before death, that is, killing a certain part of yourself that is not complete to be reborn again symbolically, is absolutely essential, especially to the masculine psyche. And a lot of it is how we have grown throughout the ages and evolved as human beings on a personal level and on a personal developmental level. So I believe a lot of these old myths give us a template for this initiation, and I think Odin's sacrifice on the world tree epitomizes it perhaps better than any others. So we start at stanza 138 in the Hávamál, which the Hávamál breaks down into English basically as the sayings of Har, or the sayings of the High One being, of course, Odin. And it's a really cool poem. It's a long poem. I'd say it's in the Poetic Edda, and I'd say it's probably like fundamentally one of the most important Norse poems there are for understanding the Norse psyche and understanding Norse mythology and what it means on a deeper, more symbolic level. So the beginning of the poem goes through a lot of really practical advice about not drinking too much, about keeping your head upon you, about being aware of your surroundings, about what's expected from a man, what's expected from a friend, what's expected from a husband. It gives you a lot of really practical advice that just kind of breaks down a code of ethos that you can live by. So a lot of Odinists today, that's kind of their code of ethos, is the beginning stanza of the Hávamál. And then as we get deeper into the Hávamál, so we get to 138, we start talking about the runes and Odin's sacrifice. So stanza 138. Veit ek at ek hek vingla mighty owl. Nightrather nu, Gairun dara geffen oni, sjálfa mer, althai mighty mongi veit quers hunt of rotam ren. So in English, I know that I hung on that windswept tree for 9 full nights, wounded by spear and given to Odin, given myself to myself, on that tree of which none knows, from whose roots doth rise. So, powerful stanza there, and it goes deeper after that. But basically the essence of this story is that Odin decided he needed, this is how Odin won the runes. And so when we go through the word rune in Norse, it's R-U-N, modern English it's R-U-N-E, but the oldest word for it in Proto-Germanic is runa, and It means basically mystery or cosmic mystery. So a lot of times we think of the runes as the very practical staves that were passed down in the migration and Viking ages, and that were used for magical reasons, and that were used for writing, and that were used, had a lot of different practical applications, but were almost always ritually used. So they were not used like a written alphabet per se, although sometimes they were, but there was usually a magical connotation behind it. So we have these practical rune staves, but the depth of the meaning of the word runa really gives away what the runes really are, and that is the cosmic mysteries of the universe, and that is what Odin hung himself on the world tree Yggdrasil to master. And it was a sacrifice. So for 9 days and 9 nights he hung there. He brags about how they neither handed him bread nor ale. He didn't take bread nor ale, I believe is the connotation there, is that it not that it was denied from him externally, but that he denied it to himself. So again, and this is going to be a common theme in these old initiatory rites of passage, is fasting, suffering, misery, and bringing yourself into the near the verge of death so that you can have a transcendent moment and be reborn. So he gave up a limited version of himself. This is the idea of the ego death, the death of his morality, to reach a higher form or cosmic consciousness and wisdom. And I believe that cycle right there is something that is appealing to all of us, because that is essentially the cycle of self-growth. You have to give up the limited version of yourself to be reborn in a better, higher version of yourself. And that process is not pleasant. That process is inherently painful. And that process is necessary, but it is also necessarily fucking brutal. So the idea here, again, this is something he had to go about alone. This is not something that he could bring anybody with, and which shows the internal which shows the internal concepts here that he was pursuing. He wasn't pursuing something external. He had to master something within himself. So alone he had to hang. He had to suffer alone and without any guarantee of reward. So that's another important thing of this initiatory process, is that there is no guarantee at the end of it. In fact, a lot of these initiations, when performed in ancient times, often ended up fatal. It's been thought that the Spartan Gauge, which was the boys' training that started at 8 years old and ended at 18, or started at 7 and it ended at 20, that was the 13-year initiation and the birth of the Spartan warrior, probably had an attrition rate of somewhere between 40 and 60%. That means that probably 40 to 60% of the boys that started their gauge didn't actually live to their 20th birthday. So that's an idea in itself. There's no guarantee of reward. It is only the worthy will survive this process. And there's something very deep and something very appealing about that. So Odin in this story is embodying the death before death. Every man must undergo to transcend mediocrity. This is how you break out of the shell of being average and you become something greater. This is how Odin broke out of the shell of something average, won the wisdom of the universe, and beset himself on this amazing path of knowledge and self-discovery that is the essence of Odin. And the crazy thing about Odin's story is he knows how it all ends. He knows that all the gods are doomed. He knows that Ragnarok is inevitable. He knows that he will die and be consumed by chaos, by the embodiment of chaos itself, the principle of chaos itself in the Fenris wolf. He knew that his son would die and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. But there's an idea of a rebirth at the end of all of that, that I believe is the essence of what Odin was striving for, to put into place everything that needed to happen for after everything is laid to waste and everything is burned, for the new rebirth to come up from the ashes. And this is essentially the idea behind this growth through adversity podcast and process. Is much of my life is built on the ritual framework of this initiation. Much of all of our lives are built on the framework of this ritual initiation. We just don't know it. So in order to understand this at a deeper and more fundamental level, we need to talk about the Indo-Europeans and ancient civilizations' view of death. For those of you that don't know, I'm obviously looking through the lens of the Germanic peoples because Norse paganism holds a special spot in my heart. But the Norse and really all modern Europeans are descended from the Indo-European tribes, which came off the steppes sometime in between the Black and Caspian Seas, sometime between probably 4 and 6,000 BCE, and they spread virtually across Europe, the Mediterranean, and even into India as the Vedic Aryans, and they conquered just about everything in their way, and they brought with them their religion, they brought with them their mythological ideas, they brought with them the three-parted societal structure, generally the kings, the warriors, the producers. All of these are universal frameworks that are still integrated in our societies that originate with the Indo-European, not to mention they brought their language. We all speak a version of modern Indo-European. It used to be one language, and then it broke down into Celtic, into Germanic, into Italic, into Greek, into Vedic, into all of these different languages. Over the course of as these populations disseminated and thousands of years separated them. But there are still fundamental frameworks that can trace all these languages back and prove that they came from a mother source or the PIE, Proto-Indo-European tongue. So absolutely fascinating. But for the Indo-Europeans, for a study on the Indo-Europeans, I think Gene Hodry's book, The Indo-Europeans, although a little bit technical and written through the lens of linguistics, I think it's a fantastic book for overall. It's a monograph, and I think it's a fantastic book for an overall understanding of them. And although it is a little bit technical, I think it's readable by most people who are willing to work through it and do a lot of the auxiliary research, a lot of the Googling of stuff that they don't understand to try to break it down a little bit more. But yeah, that one really enlightened me. It was the first really, really deep study I've done into the Indo-Europeans and their civilization and their view. And what you find is that their view on death, much like the Vikings and much like the Greeks, is that, and much like us today are still playing this out, that death is never necessarily the end. It was a threshold, and it was a liminal phase, and it was also something that happened multiple times throughout your life. So it wasn't just this, we look at death now as the end of our life, but to the Indo-Europeans, you underwent many smaller deaths throughout the course of your life before you underwent your ultimate physical death. And each one of those was just as pure and just as true as your physical death. There was no disconnect. When a boy was sent off to the forest to be with the mannerbunde and be initiated into manhood, it was seen that that boy, that child died, and what would come back would be a different man. And so this is a very, very, very deep symbolic concept that's tied deeply into parts of our psyche that control a lot of what we do and a lot of our worldview. So to truly live as a man meant symbolically die again and again, shedding the skin of weakness, comfort, and ego, and with each iteration, hopefully growing better, stronger, and more complete. So the mannerbunde was the warrior brotherhoods of ancient civilizations. Again, this is a very common Indo-European theme. It is tied heavily into the cult of the wolf. That is the origin of the werewolf story, where these were seen as wolf warriors. They followed the wolf god. And it was generally the youths of the tribe led by an esteemed elder. So there was classes of warriors in the Norse. They were called Ulfhednar, or wolf shirts, perhaps berserker, which is bear shirt. And that might have been, although both were dedicated to Odin and both were warrior brotherhoods of the most elite warriors in the society, both were professional full-time warriors. I do, from my sense from the sagas, which you always have to take with a grain of salt, and just my understanding of Norse culture and my own research, I believe there was a separation there, and I believe the berserkers were more of almost like a bodyguard type cult. They were almost like the protectors of kings, of jarls, of nobles. And when you think bodyguard in modern sense, we think of like a purely defensive, but a king's bodyguard in ancient civilization was often more of an offensive tool than it was a defensive tool. They would be sent out on the most critical missions, to take out the king's enemies, to keep the king's peace, to enforce the king's justice. So that is kind of the sense I get from the berserkers, that they were his elite shock troops that were ready at a dime, devoted to him, devoted to Odin, a warrior brotherhood in and of itself. And then the Ofhidnr, I believe, had more to do with this initiatory liminal phase of boys becoming men. And the Ofhidnr were dedicated lifelong warriors that probably took no family, probably took no wife, didn't live. There's this separation from the safe village and the dangerous and dark forest. And these initiations and these rites of passage always happened in the dangerous dark forest. And that appears to have been the realm of both the berserkers and the Ofhidnr. So what appears to have happened is that the boys of the tribe, and in the Spartan Agoj, this was institutionalized and ritualized into the very essence of the society. But the truth is, it happened in virtually all Proto-Indo-European descendant societies. And amongst the Norse, what would happen is the boys would hit a certain age set, and all of the boys of that age set, whether it was 8 or 10, 10 appears in the sagas, interestingly, especially in the sagas of the Volsung, when Signy is bringing her children out to her brother to see if they are up to the grim work of revenge of killing her husband that had killed her father and all of her brothers. One brother, Sigmund, survived, and he hid in the forest like an Ofhidnr. He even took wolf shirts. Ultimately, later was Sinfiotli, the only child that did end up being worthy of the task of revenge. But what she would do is she would bring these boys at 10 years old. The first two were boys from her and her current husband, Sigir, and they were unworthy because they had the blood of Sigir, and Sigir was a wretch. He was a nidling. And so they were unworthy for the grim work of revenge, is how the saga says it, because they would be tested by Sigmund, and they were proven to be cowards. And so ultimately, her solution to this, Signy's solution to this, was that she took the skin of a witch and disguised herself as a woman and went to her brother and slept with her brother, and they had a pure Volsung child named Sinfiotli, because she realized that it would take a pure Volsung to be up to the grim work of revenge, and Sinfiotli was utterly fearless. So this kind of plays out this whole initiatory process, is that Sinfiotli goes to the forest to be with Sigmund, and this would happen in Norse societies. The boys would be taken from the comfort of the village, from their mothers, from the female figures, and they would be given to these hard, brutal warriors that lived in the forest, that had devoted their whole life to war, and they would be reared and taught how to be a man by these men. They would be separated even from their fathers and from everything that had made them comfortable in the village, and they would be sent out with these esteemed leaders. And it was a process of learning, and it was a process of also proving that you were tough and crafty enough to survive. So this was done through isolation, through fasting, through hunting, and through fighting, through bloodletting. And a lot of the rituals, the specific elements of this ritual, are lost, but what we understand is its fundamental nature and its formulaic nature, where boy is sent to the forest, boy dies, basically, in the forest. If his body survives, he is reborn as a man, and then he can rejoin the tribe as a functioning member, and he is now allowed to take a wife and do all the things that men want to do, rear children, things of that nature. The purpose of this was to reforge themselves into instruments of cosmic order, not chaotic individuals. So you can see how this being missing in modernity could present quite a problem, especially for boys, because we are tied to this idea. We are driven to this. We want this comradeship of other men, of men teaching us how to be men, and boys of our peer group out there hazing each other and pushing each other and growing together and undergoing all of these growing pains that young boys go through. And it's just totally devoid in society. We don't have these initiations anymore. And in fact, they try to curb everything masculine, and now they try to convince boys that they're girls in these schools. So yeah, it's very depraved and twisted how far we've gotten away from this, but this still speaks to the psyche, and the only way to implement it in modern society is to just apply it to your own life. So again, let's talk about this liminal phase and the modern masculine psyche. Liminal phases mean being betwixt and between is the best description for it. You are no longer who you were yet you are not who you will become. So in business, we call this the lonely phase, because when you get serious about becoming an entrepreneur and starting this business and growing and scaling, you go through this process where you kind of outgrow the person you used to be, and you outgrow your former peer group and everybody that you used to hang out with. You have vision, you have a mission, you have purpose now, and a lot of them are stuck in a feedback loop and a cycle that no longer appeals to you, and you no longer appeal to them. So you outgrow your former friends, but you haven't grown into your next peer group, that elite peer group, that scaled peer group you're working towards. So you're betwixt in between, and we call this the lonely phase, because all you have is the grind, all you have is the business, all you have is your vision, and all you have is your purpose. And it's like I said, it's a lonely phase, but it's also an illuminating phase. You're moving from one pond to the other. You were the biggest fish in the pond you used to be in, and now you're a guppy in the next pond. But being exposed to that greatness that you're trying to become is going to help you transform yourself into what you're trying to become. As modern men, we're starved for these rites of passages because they just don't exist on a societal level anymore. That's why suffering, training, fasting, hardship, it calls to the masculine soul, because it's a part of our essence. This was our tribal identity for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's been stripped from us over the last couple hundred years, 1,000 tops. But really, this still stayed alive even after the Christianization and even after the development of Western society. These trends still stayed alive, and they just kind of went underground until very recently. You saw it rise with the warrior brotherhoods, the Templars, and all of those knightly brotherhoods throughout the medieval ages. And then that evolved into the gentleman clubs of the later ages, the dueling clubs. This essence stayed alive basically until very recently. And our spirits recognize that to become men, first we must descend. To become men, to ascend, first we must descend, die, and then be remade. So this, and you see it today, we crave these things that are more and more common that we see every day: cold plunges, grueling Spartan type training, all different types of new trainings popping up. Fasting, intermittent fasting, fad diets. These aren't really fads. They're echoes and remnants of these ancient rites trying to reemerge from our psyche. Abstention and self-mastery. Entering the halls of heaven. I've got a quote for you. The man who can refuse pleasure, who can endure hardship without complaint, who can walk the path of suffering without betraying himself, he is already among his gods. Abstaining from food, from comfort, from easy pleasure isn't deprivation. It's a ritual purification. Only through willingly choosing pain and hardship without need, without compulsion, can you earn the higher self you desire to become. True strength is when you can feast but choose to fast, when you can lash out but choose to endure, when you can escape but choose to stay and suffer for something greater. And I have a quote from Nietzsche here. Strength is the ability to feel hunger without feasting when it violates the sacred. So that gives me the chills even just to say it. Strength is the ability to feel hunger without feasting when it violates the sacred. So what we're talking about is overruling our base mammalian animal instincts with a higher creed, the sacred, right? So even though we're hungry, even though there's a lust, even though there's a hunger, the ability for a man to override that animal part of himself with the rational part of himself, I believe, is the essence of self-growth. It's romanticized in the mythology, but it's something that you can apply to your life on a very practical apotheosis. And what you need to be basically thinking about is, what parts of myself should I be trying to kill, and what parts of myself should I be trying to enhance and ensure are reborn? every time
little
you hang
death,
yourself
this
from your own
is every
Yggdrasil
time that we choose
symbolically,
suffering, every time
you
we
carve your
abstain
place
from
in the heavenly
indulgence,
halls.
every time we
You will not
abstain
be
from
carried
something
there.
that violates
You must
our
earn
code
your place.
when we don't
Odin
feast,
did not
even though we're
climb
hungry.
Yggdrasil with
And
help.
he hung
Master
himself,
that bestial
in agony,
animal part of
alone
ourself that
for
calls
9
upon
nights.
our impulses,
He died
our
as a man,
desires, and rather
he
than
awoke
allowing
as a
that
god.
to control us, we control it.
So again,
You reach a
this
higher
ritual
state,
framework
a higher level
is
of
something
consciousness,
that
a higher
is
level
very
of
deep,
being, a higher vibratory rate, and the universe begins to bend around you. Things begin to change and move in your power, in your way, because you have proven yourself to yourself and proven yourself arguably to the divine to be somebody that doesn't just crumble to their desires, doesn't just crumble to their impulses, somebody that's on a mission, somebody that has purpose, somebody that, like Odin himself, is trying to grow and become something more. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.